The hallways of Westlake High School were empty now, the final bell having rung hours ago. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching dust motes and golden beams as David Chen pushed his cleaning cart down the corridor. At 43, his steps were measured and quiet, a man used to moving through spaces without being seen. He paused outside the music room, his ears catching the faint sound of a piano. A student must have stayed late to practice. David stood there for a moment listening, his hand unconsciously tapping against his thigh in rhythm with the music. The player was struggling with a Beethoven piece, hitting wrong notes and starting over repeatedly. David smiled to himself. He remembered that feeling, the frustration of fingers that wouldn't cooperate with what the mind wanted them to do. Without thinking, he leaned his mop against the wall and peered through the small window in the door. A boy of about 16 sat hunched over the keys, his face tight with concentration. David watched as the student tried again, getting a little further before making another mistake and slapping his hand on the bench in frustration. Before he could stop himself, David pushed the door open. The hinges creaked slightly, causing the student to look up, startled. "Sorry," David said, stepping back. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "It's fine," the boy said, already turning back to the piano. "I was just leaving anyway. Can't get this stupid part right." David hesitated, then stepped into the room. "You're rushing the middle section," he said softly. The boy looked up again, really seeing David for the first time. His eyes took in the gray uniform, the ID badge that hung from a lanyard around his neck. "What?" David cleared his throat. "The middle section," he repeated. "You're rushing it. That's why your fingers are getting tangled." The boy's eyebrows rose. "You play?" David shrugged, a half-smile crossing his face. "Used to, long time ago." "Show me?" David shook his head, already backing toward the door. "I should get back to work. Mr. Peterson doesn't like when I take breaks." The boy stood up from the bench. "Please, just show me that one part. I've been stuck on it for weeks, and Ms. Rivera says I need to have it ready for the showcase next month." David glanced at his watch. He still had the entire science wing to clean, and the teacher's lounge was a mess after today's staff meeting. But something in the boy's eyes, the earnestness, the frustration he knew all too well, made him pause. "5 minutes," he said, setting down his cleaning supplies. "That's all I have." The boy grinned and scooted over on the bench. David sat down, feeling awkward and oversized next to the teenager. His hands hovered over the keys for a moment, suddenly unsure. It had been years since he'd played on a piano this nice, a proper grand piano. Not the old upright he had at home with the sticky D key and slightly out-of-tune middle section. He pressed a few keys experimentally, feeling the action, the weight of them under his fingers. Then, without looking at the sheet music, he began to play the troublesome section. His fingers remembered, even if his mind didn't. They found the notes automatically, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. The passage flowed from his hands, the tempo exactly right. Each note clear and distinct but connected to the ones around it. When he finished the section, he looked up to find the boy staring at him, mouth slightly open. "How did you do that?" the boy asked. "You didn't even look at the music." David shrugged again, suddenly self-conscious. "Played it before," he said. "Long time ago. Can you play the whole thing?" David shook his head, already standing. "Really need to get back to work," he said, moving toward his cart. "But slow down that middle section. Count it out loud if you need to. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Don't rush." The boy nodded, still looking at David with newfound interest. "Thanks," he said. "I'm Thomas, by the way." "David," he replied, nodding once before pushing his cart back into the hallway. As he continued his rounds, David couldn't help but feel a small spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Pride, maybe, or just the simple pleasure of being seen for something other than the man who emptied the trash cans. When he got home that night to his small one-bedroom apartment, the first thing he did was sit down at his old piano. The upright had been his mother's, the one good thing he'd kept when they sold her house after she died. The finish was scratched in places, and some of the ivory keytops were yellowed with age, but it was still in decent shape, all things considered. David ran his fingers over the keys without pressing them, remembering the feel of the school's grand piano. Then he began to play, really play, for the first time in months. Not just the simple tunes he usually picked out when he was feeling lonely, but the complicated pieces he'd once known by heart. His fingers were stiff at first, missing notes, fumbling transitions he'd once sailed through. But the more he played, the more it came back to him. By the time the clock on his microwave read 1 a.m., he was lost in the music, his tiny apartment filled with sound. The next morning, his alarm went off at 5 a.m. as usual. David groaned, his fingers aching in a way they hadn't in years. He made his coffee strong and downed 2 aspirin with it, thinking about the stack of bills on his counter. The electric bill was overdue again, and his car insurance was due next week. At least his rent was paid for the month, just barely. As he drove to work in his old Honda with its rattling heater, David thought about how different his life might have been. He'd been good once, really good. His piano teacher had talked about music schools, scholarships, competitions. But then his father had gotten sick during his senior year, and the medical bills had piled up. There had been no money for college applications, let alone tuition. So he'd taken a job at the factory where his uncle worked, telling himself it was just for a year or 2. But 1 year had turned into 5, and 5 into 10. His father had died, then his mother. The factory had closed. Somewhere along the way, the dream of being a musician had faded, replaced by the simple struggle to keep a roof over his head and food on his table. The school parking lot was nearly empty when he arrived. Just a few teachers' cars and the principal's SUV. David parked in his usual spot near the dumpsters and used his key to let himself in the side entrance. The early morning hours before students arrived were his time to vacuum the main areas and clean the bathrooms without interruption. He had just finished the main office when he heard piano music coming from down the hall. David paused, his hand on the vacuum cord. It was too early for students, and none of the teachers played as far as he knew. Curiosity got the better of him. He wound up the vacuum cord and walked toward the sound. The music room door was open, light spilling into the dim hallway. David peered inside. Ms. Rivera, the music teacher, sat at the piano, her back to the door. She was playing something he didn't recognize, something modern with jazz influences. Her head swayed slightly with the rhythm, her shoulders relaxed, completely absorbed in the piece. David stood there listening, not wanting to interrupt. When she finished, her hands resting on the keys for a moment afterward, he took a step backward, intending to leave before she noticed him. The floorboard under his foot creaked. Ms. Rivera turned, startled. "Oh, David, you scared me." "Sorry," he said, embarrassed. "Just walking by. Didn't mean to eavesdrop." She smiled, turning fully on the bench to face him. "It's fine. I'm the one who shouldn't be here so early. I just wanted to practice a bit before the day started." David nodded, already backing away. "It sounded nice," he offered. "The piece you were playing?" "Thank you," she said. "It's for the faculty performance at the end of the talent show next month. I'm a bit rusty, to be honest. Haven't had much time to practice lately." "You sounded good to me," David said, and meant it. Ms. Rivera tilted her head, studying him. "Thomas Wright told me you helped him with his Beethoven piece yesterday." David felt his face warm. "Just showed him a part he was struggling with." "No big deal. He said you played it perfectly without looking at the music." David shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "Just a short section," he mumbled. Ms. Rivera patted the bench beside her. "Play something for me." David shook his head immediately. "I should get back to work. Still have the science wing to do before first period." "Just a minute or 2, she pressed. "I've been teaching music at this school for 6 years, and I had no idea we had a pianist on the maintenance staff." "I'm not," David said quickly. "Not really. Not anymore." Ms. Rivera raised an eyebrow. "Once a musician, always a musician," she said. "Even if you're out of practice." Something in her words struck a chord in David. He'd thought of himself as an ex-musician for so long, someone who used to play. The idea that music might still be part of his identity, even after all these years of silence, was both comforting and painful. "Maybe another time," he said finally, gesturing to his uniform. "I really should finish up before the students get here." Ms. Rivera nodded, not pushing further. "My door is always open," she said. "The piano, too." David nodded his thanks and continued on his rounds, the sound of her playing following him down the hall as she returned to her practice. As he vacuumed the science wing, his mind kept returning to the way the grand piano had felt under his fingers yesterday, how natural it had been to slide back into something he'd once loved so deeply. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder what would happen if he started playing again. Really playing. Not just picking out simple tunes on his old upright when no one was around to hear, but playing the way he used to, with his whole heart. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. The weeks leading up to Westlake High's annual talent show were always chaotic. Posters lined the hallways, students practiced in every available corner, and an air of excitement mixed with nervousness filled the school. For David, it meant extra work. More trash to empty, more floors to mop, more messes to clean up after rehearsals. He didn't mind, though. There was something about the energy in the school during these weeks that made even his most mundane tasks feel like part of something bigger. Ever since his brief encounter with Ms. Rivera in the music room, David had felt a shift in how some of the staff treated him. Nothing dramatic, just small acknowledgments. Ms. Rivera would wave when she saw him in the hallway now. Thomas, the piano student, would stop to chat about music when they crossed paths. Even Mr. Peterson, the head custodian, had noticed. "Making friends with the fancy music folks, are we?" he'd asked one day as they ate lunch in the maintenance room. David had shrugged, embarrassed. "Just helped a kid with a piano piece." Mr. Peterson had given him a long look. "Didn't know you played." "Used to," David had replied, the same answer he gave everyone. Long time ago, the day before the talent show, David was cleaning the auditorium when he heard raised voices from backstage. Curious, he made his way toward the sound, mop in hand. Ms. Rivera stood with a group of students, her usually calm face creased with worry. A tall boy David recognized as one of the seniors was gesturing with his phone. "She just texted me," the boy was saying. "She's got a fever of 102. No way she can perform tomorrow." "But the whole opening number is built around the piano part," said a girl with long braids. "We can't just cut it." "What about backing tracks?" suggested another student. Ms. Rivera shook her head. "We don't have time to create and rehearse with a backing track. The show is tomorrow night." David hung back, not wanting to interrupt, but Ms. Rivera spotted him hovering near the curtains. "David," she called, a note of relief in her voice. "Just the person who might be able to help us." All the students turned to look at him, and David felt his stomach drop. He had a feeling he knew where this was going. "We have a bit of a crisis," Ms. Rivera explained, walking toward him. "Our pianist for the opening number is sick and won't be able to perform tomorrow." "Thomas mentioned you play—" David tightened his grip on the mop handle. "Not anymore," he said quickly. "Not like that. I just mess around sometimes." Ms. Rivera's face fell, but she nodded. "I understand." It was worth asking. The disappointment in her eyes made something twist in David's chest. He glanced at the students who had already turned back to their discussion, trying to figure out a solution to their problem. "What's the piece?" he heard himself ask. Ms. Rivera looked up, hope flickering across her face. "Just a simple accompaniment for the choir's opening number. Heart and Soul with some variations. Nothing too complicated." David knew the song. Everyone who'd ever touched a piano knew Heart and Soul. It was one of the first things he'd learned as a kid. "I could take a look at it," he said hesitantly, not promising anything. The smile that broke across Ms. Rivera's face made him immediately regret his words. What was he thinking? He couldn't perform in front of the whole school. He was the janitor, the guy who emptied the trash and mopped up spills. Students barely noticed him as he moved through the hallways. The thought of all those eyes on him made his palms sweat. "That would be wonderful," Ms. Rivera said, already digging through a folder of sheet music. "Here it is. We have a quick rehearsal in 10 minutes with the choir. Could you stay?" David looked at his watch. His shift was nearly over, and he'd planned to finish the auditorium before heading home. But the hopeful look on Ms. Rivera's face and the curious glances from the students made it impossible to back out now. "Let me just tell Mr. Peterson," he said. The choir rehearsal wasn't as bad as David had feared. The arrangement of Heart and Soul was simple enough, with a few variations to make it more interesting. The choir, 20 students in all, seemed surprised when he sat down at the piano, but they were polite enough not to make a big deal of it. As he played through the piece the first time, David felt rusty and awkward. His fingers hit wrong notes and he had to stop and start again several times, but by the third run-through he was feeling more comfortable, even adding a few flourishes of his own to the basic arrangement. "That sounds great, David," Ms. Rivera said after they finished. "Are you sure you haven't performed recently?" David shook his head, embarrassed by the praise. "Just at home. By myself." "Well, you're saving our opening number," she said. The show starts at 7 tomorrow. Could you be here by 6:30 for a final run-through? David nodded, already wondering what he'd gotten himself into. The reality of what he'd agreed to do was starting to sink in. He'd be on stage, in front of people, playing the piano, something he hadn't done in public since high school. That night he could barely sleep. He sat at his upright piano until midnight, playing Heart and Soul over and over until his downstairs neighbor banged on the ceiling. Then he switched to silent practice, his fingers moving over the keys without pressing them down, going through the motions of the piece in his mind. The next day at work felt endless. David went through his cleaning routine mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Every time he thought about the evening ahead, his stomach clenched with anxiety. Several times he nearly went to Ms. Rivera to back out, but something stopped him each time. Maybe it was the memory of how happy she'd looked when he'd agreed to help. Or maybe it was some small part of himself that actually wanted this chance, as terrifying as it was. By the time he clocked out at 5:00, David's nerves were so frayed he could barely focus. He drove home in a daze, showered, and stood in front of his closet, suddenly realizing he had no idea what to wear. All he had were his work uniforms and a few casual clothes, jeans, t-shirts, hoodies, nothing suitable for a performance. In the end, he settled on his cleanest pair of jeans and a plain blue button-up shirt he usually saved for job interviews. It wasn't fancy, but it was the best he could do. When he arrived back at the school, the parking lot was already filling up with parents and students. David parked in his usual spot and used the side entrance, hoping to avoid the crowds. Backstage was a flurry of activity. Students in costumes, teachers giving last-minute instructions, tech crew adjusting lights and sound equipment. Miss Rivera spotted him as soon as he walked in and hurried over, relief evident on her face. "David, thank goodness. I was starting to worry you might have changed your mind." "Nearly did," he admitted with a weak smile. She squeezed his arm. "You're going to be great. We just have time for one quick run-through with the choir before the doors open." The rehearsal went smoothly enough, but David could feel his anxiety building with each passing minute. By the time he was waiting in the wings for the show to start, his hands were shaking so badly he had to shove them into his pockets. Principal Wong stepped onto the stage to welcome everyone and introduce the show. David peeked through the curtains, his heart sinking at the sight of the packed auditorium. There had to be at least 500 people out there. "I can't do this," he whispered to himself, taking a step back. "First up," Principal Wong was saying, "our talented choir will perform a special arrangement of a classic favorite." Ms. Rivera appeared at David's side, her hand on his back, gently guiding him toward the stage. "That's our cue," she said softly. David's feet felt like lead as he walked onto the stage. The lights were blinding, making it hard to see the audience, which was both a relief and somehow more terrifying. He made his way to the grand piano at center stage, aware of the whispers and murmurs from the crowd. He sat down on the bench, adjusting it slightly, and placed his trembling hands on the keys. The choir filed in behind him, taking their positions on the risers. Miss Rivera gave him an encouraging nod from the side of the stage. David took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. For a moment he considered simply running off the stage, leaving the school, maybe even the town, starting over somewhere else where no one would know about this humiliation. But then he looked down at his hands on the keys, the same hands that had once played Chopin and Beethoven with confidence and passion. Hands that still knew how to make music even if they were out of practice. Something shifted inside him. A calm settling over the storm of his anxiety. He'd played this piece 100 times at home. He could do this. David nodded to Ms. Rivera, who raised her hands to conduct the choir. And then he began to play. The familiar notes of Heart and Soul filled the auditorium, his fingers finding their way without conscious thought. The choir came in right on cue, their young voices blending with the piano in perfect harmony. As he played, David felt his nervousness begin to fade, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years. The simple joy of making music for others to hear. He added little embellishments to the basic arrangement, flourishes that made the familiar tune more interesting, more his own. By the time they reached the final chorus, David was no longer thinking about the audience or his fears. He was just playing, lost in the music, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. The piece ended with a gentle chord, hanging in the air for a moment before fading to silence. And then the applause began. David looked up, startled by the sound. The lights had dimmed enough that he could see the audience now on their feet, clapping enthusiastically. The choir behind him was beaming, and Ms. Rivera was giving him a thumbs up from the side of the stage. For the first time in longer than he could remember, David felt a genuine smile spread across his face. He stood, gave a small bow, and hurried off the stage as the next act was announced. "That was wonderful," Ms. Rivera exclaimed, meeting him in the wings. "You were amazing!" David shrugged, embarrassed but pleased. "It's just heart and soul," he said. "Anyone could play it." "Not the way you just did," she replied, her eyes bright with excitement. "Listen, the closing number is a solo piano piece. One of our seniors was going to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, but she's the one who's sick." "I don't suppose—" David's momentary confidence wavered. Playing a simple accompaniment was one thing. A solo classical piece was something else entirely. "I don't know," he said hesitantly. "It's been a long time since I played anything like that." "Just think about it," Ms. Rivera said. "The show runs for about 2 hours. You have time to decide." As she hurried off to deal with the next performers, David found a quiet corner backstage to sit and catch his breath. His hands were still trembling, but now it was from adrenaline rather than fear. He couldn't believe he'd just played in front of hundreds of people. And they'd applauded. They'd stood up and applauded for him. David Chen, the janitor who mopped their floors and emptied their trash. Maybe, just maybe, he could do it again. David found a folding chair in a quiet corner backstage and sat down, his hands still tingling from playing the piano. Around him, students rushed back and forth, changing costumes, adjusting microphones, practicing dance moves. No one paid much attention to him. They were too wrapped up in their own performances to notice the janitor who'd just played the opening number. He pulled out his phone and saw a text from his neighbor, Mrs. Patel, watching the live stream. "Didn't know you could play like that. So proud of you." David stared at the message in surprise. He'd forgotten the school streamed the talent show online for parents who couldn't attend in person. The idea that people were watching him from their homes made his stomach twist with a fresh wave of anxiety. "There you are." Thomas appeared in front of him, grinning from ear to ear. "That was awesome. Everyone's talking about how good you were." David looked up, confused. "I just played heart and soul. It's not exactly complicated." Thomas shook his head. "No, you didn't. I mean, yeah, it started as heart and soul, but then you did all this other stuff with it. The harmonies and the little runs? That wasn't in the sheet music. Had he done that?" David couldn't remember adding anything special to the arrangement. He'd just played the way he always did at home, following where the music wanted to go. "Ms. Rivera wants to know if you're going to do the closing number," Thomas said, lowering his voice. "Lily's mom called and said her fever's worse. There's no way she's making it tonight. The closing number, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major." David hadn't played it in years, but he knew it well. It had been one of his favorites back when he still dreamed of becoming a real pianist. "I don't know," he said, the familiar weight of doubt settling over him. "I'm not prepared. I don't have the sheet music memorized anymore." "Ms. Rivera has the music," Thomas said. "And there's a practice room with a piano you can use during the show." Before David could respond, the backstage manager, a senior with a headset and clipboard, hushed everyone as the next act was introduced. A group of freshman girls walked onto the stage to perform a dance routine. "Think about it," Thomas whispered before disappearing into the crowd of students. For the next hour, David sat in his corner, torn between the urge to leave and the pull of the music that had once been the center of his life. The idea of playing Chopin, really playing, not just a simple tune like Heart and Soul, made his heart race. What if he messed up? What if he embarrassed himself in front of everyone? But what if he didn't? What if, for one night, he could be the musician he'd once dreamed of becoming? During intermission, he slipped into one of the practice rooms and found the sheet music for the Nocturne waiting for him on the piano. David sat down, his work jeans rough against the smooth piano bench, and placed his hands on the keys. The first few notes were hesitant, his fingers searching for the right keys. But then muscle memory took over and the music began to flow. It wasn't perfect. He stumbled over some of the trickier passages, and his timing was off in places, but the heart of the piece was there, the gentle, melancholy beauty of Chopin's composition coming through despite his rustiness. He played it through twice, focusing on the sections that gave him trouble. By the third time, it was starting to come back to him, his fingers remembering what his mind had forgotten. A soft knock on the door interrupted him. Ms. Rivera poked her head in, her expression hopeful. "That sounds wonderful," she said. "Have you decided?" David looked down at his hands, calloused from years of manual labor, but still capable of creating something beautiful. He thought about the applause after Heart and Soul, how it had felt to connect with an audience again after so many years of playing only for himself. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "But I'm not wearing this." He gestured to his jeans and button-up shirt. Ms. Rivera smiled, relief washing over her face. "I think we can find something for you to wear." "What size suit do you wear?" 20 minutes later, David stood in the tiny bathroom backstage staring at his reflection in the mirror. The suit Ms. Rivera had found for him, borrowed from the drama department's costume closet, was a bit too big, the shoulders hanging slightly loose and the pants a touch too long. But with the sleeves rolled up once and the pants cuffed, it looked decent enough. Someone had found a tie too, deep blue with subtle silver stripes. It had been years since David had worn a suit. The last time was for his mother's funeral 7 years ago. He barely recognized himself now. His work uniform replaced by formal clothes, his hair combed neatly to one side. The second half of the talent show seemed to fly by. David watched from the wings as students sang pop songs, performed magic tricks, recited poetry, and showcased a dozen other talents. Each act brought the closing number closer, and with it his return to the stage. When there were only 2 acts left before his performance, Ms. Rivera found him again. "Any last questions?" she asked. David shook his head, his mouth too dry to speak. "You'll be wonderful," she assured him, squeezing his arm. "Oh, and Principal Wong wants to introduce you properly." "What should I tell him? Just David Chen? Or do you have any musical background you'd like mentioned?" The question caught him off guard. His musical background? A childhood spent at the piano, lessons every Saturday for 12 years, competitions won, dreams of Juilliard abandoned when life got in the way. How could all of that be summed up in a brief introduction? "Just David is fine," he said finally. "Nothing else matters." Ms. Rivera looked like she wanted to say more, but the stage manager was calling for the next act, and she hurried away to help a student with a malfunctioning microphone. And then, suddenly, it was time. The final student act, a boy playing an impressive guitar solo, finished to enthusiastic applause. As the boy left the stage, Principal Wong stepped into the spotlight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special treat for our closing number tonight," he announced. As some of you know, Lily Chen, who was scheduled to perform Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, is homesick with the flu. But we're incredibly fortunate that another talented pianist has agreed to step in. David stood in the wings, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could back out now. He could turn and walk away, drive home, and forget this whole crazy night. No one would blame him. He was just the janitor after all, not a performer. "Please welcome to the stage Mr. David Chen." The spotlight swung toward the side of the stage, and David felt its heat on his face. It was too late to run now. Taking a deep breath, he stepped onto the stage, blinking in the bright light. The grand piano waited for him at center stage, its polished surface gleaming under the lights. David walked toward it, aware of the murmurs from the audience. He could hear snippets of whispered conversations. "Isn't that the janitor? The guy who played the opening number? What's he doing now?" He sat down at the piano, adjusting the bench to the right height. The sheet music was there, but as he looked at it, David realized he didn't need it. Despite the years that had passed, despite the calluses on his fingers from mops and brooms rather than piano keys, he knew this piece by heart. David closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm his racing pulse. He thought about all the nights he'd sat alone at his old upright piano, playing this very piece and imagining an audience listening. Now the audience was real, hundreds of people waiting for him to begin. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The first notes of the nocturne filled the auditorium, delicate and precise. David kept his eyes on the keys, focusing on each note, each phrase. The familiar melody wrapped around him like an old friend, comforting and challenging all at once. As he played, something strange began to happen. The nervousness that had gripped him backstage started to fade, replaced by a deep, almost meditative concentration. The audience, the school, Even his own doubts seemed to recede, leaving only the music and his hands on the keys. Without conscious decision, David's playing began to change. He wasn't just reproducing the notes on the page anymore. He was interpreting them, breathing life into them, adding his own emotions to Chopin's composition. All the years of longing, of regret, of quiet resilience, they flowed from his fingers into the music, transforming the nocturne from a recital piece into something personal and profound. The dynamics shifted under his hands. Softer here, more forceful there. Each note precisely weighted to convey exactly what he was feeling. His body swayed with the music, no longer stiff with anxiety, but fluid and expressive. In that moment, David wasn't thinking about the audience or their judgment. He wasn't thinking about his job or his bills or the modest life he'd settled for. He was thinking only of the music, of the pure joy of creating something beautiful. As he approached the final section of the piece, David felt a strange sensation on his face. It took him a second to realize he was crying, tears slipping silently down his cheeks as he played. But his hands never faltered, carrying the melody to its gentle conclusion. The final note hung in the air, a single perfect sound that seemed to linger even after his fingers had left the keys. For a moment, there was complete silence in the auditorium. David sat at the piano, his hands still hovering over the keys, his heart pounding in his chest. And then the applause began, hesitant at first, then growing, building, until it filled the room like thunder. David looked up, startled to see people rising from their seats, their faces bright with emotion. Some were clapping wildly, others calling out in appreciation, a few even wiping away tears of their own. Principal Wong was the first to his feet, his usual reserved demeanor replaced by open amazement. Next to him, Ms. Rivera was beaming, clapping her hands above her head. Even the students who'd paid no attention to him for years were standing, staring at him like they'd never seen him before, because they hadn't. Not really. They'd seen David Chen, the janitor, the invisible man who cleaned up after them. They'd never seen David Chen, the musician, until tonight. David stood shakily, overwhelmed by the response. He gave a small, awkward bow, unsure of what else to do. The applause continued, showing no signs of stopping. Someone in the back of the auditorium let out a sharp whistle of appreciation, and several people near the front called for an encore. It was more than he'd ever imagined, more than he'd dared to hope for. For the first time in years, David felt truly seen, not for what he did to earn a living, but for who he really was, deep down. A musician. Still, the applause seemed to go on forever. David stood awkwardly by the piano, unsure what to do with his hands or where to look. He'd never experienced anything like this. Hundreds of people on their feet clapping and cheering for him. For him, David Chen, the man they barely noticed as he mopped their floors. Principal Wong finally stepped onto the stage, still clapping as he approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the applause, "David Chen." Another wave of cheers washed over the auditorium. David gave one more small bow before hurrying off the stage, his face burning with a mixture of embarrassment and exhilaration. Backstage was chaos. Students who had performed earlier were gathered in small groups watching on monitors as Principal Wong wrapped up the show with a few final announcements. But as David emerged from the wings, they turned toward him, their faces lit with newfound respect. "That was incredible," said a girl who had sung a Taylor Swift song earlier in the evening. "Where did you learn to play like that?" asked another student. "Have you recorded anything? Do you perform anywhere else? Are you a professional?" The questions came from all sides, overwhelming David, who had spent years being essentially invisible in these same hallways. He mumbled vague responses, trying to push his way through the crowd toward the exit. All he wanted now was to go home, to process what had just happened in the quiet of his apartment. But Ms. Rivera caught his arm before he could escape. "David, wait," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "There are some people who want to meet you." She led him to a small group waiting by the stage door, Principal Wong, the superintendent of schools, and a man David didn't recognize, dressed in an expensive-looking suit. "David, this is Robert Lin," Principal Wong said, gesturing to the stranger. "He's on the board of the Community Arts Center downtown." "Robert, this is our David Chen." The man stepped forward, extending his hand. "That was quite a performance, Mr. Chen," he said, his handshake firm. I haven't heard Chopin played with such feeling in a long time, and certainly not at a high school talent show. David nodded, still too overwhelmed to form coherent sentences. His ears were ringing, and the bright lights of the backstage area made everything seem slightly unreal. I understand you're on the maintenance staff here? Mr. Lin continued. Yes, David managed to say. For about 7 years now. Mr. Lin exchanged a glance with Principal Wong. Well, I'd love to talk with you about possibly performing at our summer concert series. We feature local musicians every weekend in June and July. Paid performances, of course, paid performances. The words echoed in David's mind, strange and foreign. He hadn't been paid to play the piano since high school, when he'd made a few dollars accompanying the church choir on Sundays. I don't really, David stammered. You don't have to decide now, Mr. Lin said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a business card. Think about it. Give me a call next week if you're interested. David took the card automatically, still struggling to process what was happening. Principal Wong clapped him on the shoulder. We've been hiding a virtuoso in our custodial staff, he said, his tone both impressed and slightly embarrassed. Who would have thought? The superintendent nodded, her expression thoughtful. Have you ever considered teaching, Mr. Chen? We're always looking for talented music instructors. Teaching? David nearly laughed out loud.
Him, a teacher?
Standing in front of a classroom telling students what to do. The idea was absurd. He was the guy who cleaned up after the teachers, not someone who could be one. I don't have a degree, he said. Never finished college. There are ways around that, the superintendent said. Especially for someone with your obvious talent. We could talk about emergency certification options. David's head was spinning. An hour ago, he'd been just the janitor who had somehow agreed to fill in for a sick student. Now people were talking to him about paid performances and teaching positions, as if his entire identity had been rewritten in the time it took to play one piece of music. I should go, he said abruptly. I have to. He didn't finish the sentence, just turned and walked away, pushing through the backstage door and out into the cool night air. Behind him, he could hear Ms. Rivera making apologies, explaining that he was probably overwhelmed by the attention. She wasn't wrong. The parking lot was still half full, parents and students lingering to chat after the show. David kept his head down, hoping no one would notice him as he made his way to his car. But he'd gone only a few steps when he heard someone call his name. Mr. Chen. David, wait up! He turned to see Thomas jogging toward him, still dressed in the suit he'd worn for his own performance earlier in the evening. You're leaving already? Thomas asked, catching up to him. Everyone's talking about your performance. My dad wants to know if you're on Spotify. David shook his head, fumbling in his pocket for his car keys. I'm not on anything, he said. I need to go home. Thomas seemed to sense his discomfort. Yeah, sure, I get it. It's a lot. But hey, you were amazing, really. I've never heard anyone play like that in real life, only in recordings. Something in the boy's earnest praise cut through David's confusion, bringing a small smile to his lips. Thanks, he said. Your Beethoven piece was great too. Thomas beamed at the compliment. I've been working on it for months, but after hearing you play, I think I need to practice about 1,000 more hours. David surprised himself by laughing. Practice is good, he said. But don't forget to put yourself into the music too. That's what makes it worth hearing. Where had that come from? He sounded like his old piano teacher, Mr. Gallo, who had always pushed him to play with feeling rather than just technical precision. Thomas nodded seriously, as if David had just shared a profound secret. I'll remember that, he said. Then, after a slight hesitation, will you be at school on Monday? I'd love to ask you some questions about interpretation, if that's okay. Monday, school, his job. Reality came crashing back. Whatever had happened tonight, whatever transformation the audience had witnessed, Monday would bring a return to normal. He'd still be the janitor, still pushing his mop down the same hallway, still invisible to most of the people who had applauded him tonight. I'll be there, David said, same as always. But as he drove home in his old Honda, the borrowed suit jacket folded neatly on the passenger seat, David wondered if that was true. Could he really go back to the way things were before, now that people had seen this other side of him? Now that he himself had remembered what it felt like to make music that moved others, could he just return to his quiet, unremarkable life? His apartment felt smaller than usual when he unlocked the door, the silence heavier. David hung up the borrowed suit carefully, making a mental note to return it on Monday. Then he sat down at his old upright piano, resting his fingers on the yellowed keys without pressing them. For years, this piano had been his only audience, the only witness to the talent he'd once hoped to share with the world. Tonight, for the first time in so long, others had heard what he could do, and they had stood and applauded. They had seen him, really seen him. David began to play, softly at first, then with growing confidence. Chopin again, but a different piece. A polonaise, bright and lively, music that matched the unfamiliar feeling growing in his chest. Hope, maybe, or possibility. He played until his fingers ached and his downstairs neighbor knocked on the ceiling again. Then reluctantly he closed the piano and went to bed, though he doubted he would sleep much. Morning brought a reality check in the form of bills spread across his kitchen table. Electric due next week, car insurance the week after that, rent at the end of the month. His life hadn't magically transformed overnight. He was still David Chen, still living paycheck to paycheck, still responsible for the same obligations he'd had yesterday. But as he sipped his coffee, his phone lit up with a notification. A text from Ms. Rivera. Hope you're doing okay after last night. When you're ready to talk, I have some ideas about where your talent could take you. No pressure. Just options, options. The word lingered in his mind as he showered and dressed. When was the last time he'd felt he had options? Before he could talk himself out of it, David picked up his phone and texted back, "I'm listening." Ms. Rivera's response came almost immediately. "Breakfast? Joe's Diner in 30 minutes?" David hesitated for only a second before typing, "I'll be there." Joe's Diner was busy for a Saturday morning, every booth filled with families and groups of friends enjoying pancakes and coffee. David spotted Miss Rivera at a corner table and made his way toward her, uncomfortably aware of the stares and whispers that followed him. "Word travels fast in a small town," Ms. Rivera said as he sat down, nodding toward a nearby table where a family was not so subtly pointing at him. "You're kind of a local celebrity this morning." David shifted in his seat, embarrassed. "I just played the piano," he said. "It's not a big deal." Ms. Rivera raised an eyebrow. "The video has over 5,000 views already," she said, sliding her phone across the table. David stared at the screen in disbelief. There he was, sitting at the grand piano on stage playing Chopin as if his life depended on it. The school's live stream had captured his performance from an angle that showed both his hands on the keys and his face, tears glistening on his cheeks as he played. "People are sharing it like crazy," Ms. Rivera continued. "A couple of local news stations have already called the school asking for an interview with you." David pushed the phone back toward her, suddenly feeling exposed. "I don't want to be on TV," he said quickly. "I'm not. That's not me." "But it is you," Ms. Rivera said gently. "That's exactly who you are, David. A gifted musician who moves people with his playing. The question is, what do you want to do with that gift now?" The waitress arrived to take their order, giving David a moment to gather his thoughts. What did he want? For so long, his wants had been simple, practical things. Enough money to pay his bills, a reliable car, maybe someday an apartment with better insulation so he wouldn't freeze in the winter. But beneath those basic needs, there had always been other desires, ones he'd pushed down so deep he'd almost forgotten them. The desire to make music that mattered, the desire to be seen and valued for his talent, not just his willingness to do jobs others considered beneath him. "I don't know," he admitted after the waitress left. "I'm 43 years old. It's a little late to become a concert pianist." Ms. Rivera laughed, a warm sound without mockery. "I'm not suggesting you try to get into Juilliard," she said. "But there are ways to incorporate music back into your life if that's what you want. Teaching, performing locally, maybe even recording some pieces for online distribution." She pulled a folder from her bag and opened it on the table, revealing printouts of various music programs and opportunities. "The community college has a music program that offers evening classes," she said, pointing to one sheet. "You could start there, maybe work toward a degree part-time while keeping your job at the school." David glanced at the paper, noting the tuition costs. "I can't afford that," he said automatically. "There are scholarships for adult learners," Ms. Rivera countered. "And the art center that Robert Lynn mentioned? They have a teaching program for underprivileged kids. They pay well for qualified instructors, and I'm pretty sure after last night you'd qualify." She flipped to another page. "Or there's this. The community theater needs a pianist for their summer musical. Paid position, rehearsals 2 evenings a week and weekends. David looked at the stack of papers, each one representing a door he had thought permanently closed to him. Could he really walk through any of them at his age, after so many years away from the world of music? It's overwhelming, he admitted. Yesterday I was just the janitor. Today you're talking about scholarships and teaching positions. Ms. Rivera reached across the table and placed her hand on his arm. Yesterday you were always a musician, she said firmly. You just didn't let anyone see it. Now that we have, we'd be fools not to help you share your gift. The waitress returned with their food, but David barely noticed what she placed in front of him. His mind was too full of new possibilities, too busy imagining a life where music was at the center rather than the margins. I'd have to keep my job, he said slowly, at least for now. I can't just quit and hope the music stuff works out. Ms. Rivera nodded. Of course. Baby steps. Maybe start with the community theater position. See how it feels to play regularly again, to be part of a musical community? David thought about it as he sipped his coffee. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Playing for an audience again. Being valued for his music, not just his labor. Creating something beautiful instead of just cleaning up messes. Okay, he said finally. I'll try the theater job. If they'll have me, Ms. Rivera's face broke into a wide smile. They'll be lucky to get you, she said. And this is just the beginning, David. Just the first step. For the first time in years, David allowed himself to believe that might be true. That last night's performance wasn't just a momentary return to the person he used to be, but the start of becoming someone new, or rather, becoming more fully himself. As he left the diner an hour later, several people stopped him to shake his hand and congratulate him on his performance. A woman he recognized from the bank asked if he gave piano lessons. An elderly man told him that his playing had brought back memories of concerts he'd attended in New York 50 years ago. David thanked them all, still uncomfortable with the attention but also strangely moved by it. All these years he'd been walking among these same people, invisible, just the man who cleaned the school their children attended. Now they were looking at him, really looking at him and seeing something valuable, something worth their respect. It was dizzying, terrifying, wonderful. As he walked to his car, David's phone vibrated with a new text message. It was from an unknown number. Mr. Chen, this is Robert Lin from the Arts Center. Just checking if you've had time to consider my offer about the summer concert series. No pressure, but we'd love to feature you in our opening weekend in June. David stared at the message, a smile slowly spreading across his face. June was still months away. Plenty of time to practice, to prepare, to become again the musician he had once been. No, to become an even better musician than before. One who played not just with technical skill, but with all the depth and feeling that life had given him. I'll do it, he texted back. Thank you for the opportunity. As he drove home, David found himself already planning what he would play, how he would practice, what he might wear on stage. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was looking forward to something beyond just making it through another day. The transformation that had begun on stage last night was continuing, carrying him toward a future he had stopped believing was possible. A future filled with music, with connection, with purpose. A future where he was seen for who he truly was. The weeks following the talent show passed in a blur for David. By Monday morning, the video of his performance had spread far beyond the small town of Westlake. Local news stations picked up the story. School janitor stuns audience with hidden musical talent. And David found himself dodging reporters in the school parking lot. Just give them a short statement, Principal Wong suggested when he found David hiding in the supply closet during his lunch break. They'll lose interest eventually, but right now you're the feel-good story everyone wants to hear. Reluctantly, David agreed to one interview with the local newspaper. The reporter, a kind woman in her 50s, asked about his background, his training, how he'd ended up as a janitor despite his obvious talent. Life happens, David said simply. My dad got sick when I was in high school. Medical bills piled up. College wasn't an option anymore. I took a job at the factory where my uncle worked, and that was that. Do you regret the path your life took? The reporter asked. David thought about it for a long moment. I regret losing touch with music for so long, he finally said. But I don't regret the lessons I've learned along the way. Working hard, being humble, appreciating the small moments of beauty in an ordinary day. The article ran the following Sunday, accompanied by a photo of David sitting at the piano in the school music room, his work uniform exchanged for a simple button-up shirt Ms. Rivera had insisted he wear for the picture. The headline read, "The Melody of Second Chances, David Chen's Remarkable Journey." People started recognizing him around town, at the grocery store, at the gas station, even at the laundromat where he spent Sunday afternoons washing his clothes. They'd approach with shy smiles, telling him how moved they'd been by his playing, how inspiring his story was. Some asked if he gave lessons. Others wanted to know when he'd be performing again. David wasn't sure how to handle the attention. For so long he'd been invisible, moving through the world without anyone taking much notice. Now suddenly people saw him, not just as the guy who cleaned up after them, but as someone with a gift, someone worth knowing. At school, things changed too. Students who had never acknowledged his presence before now greeted him in the hallways. Teachers invited him to eat lunch with them in the staff room instead of alone in the maintenance office. Ms. Rivera stopped by almost daily to update him on new opportunities she'd found, scholarships he might apply for, competitions open to adult musicians, local venues looking for performers. The most surprising change came 3 weeks after the talent show, when Principal Wong called David into his office. "How would you feel about adding some hours to your schedule?" he asked once David was seated across from his desk. David's heart sank. More janitorial work meant less time to practice the piano, less time to explore the new possibilities that were opening up for him. "What kind of hours?" he asked cautiously. "Teaching hours," Principal Wong replied, a small smile playing at his lips. "Ms. Rivera tells me you've been helping Thomas with his piano technique. She says he's improved more in the last 3 weeks than in the entire semester before." David shrugged, embarrassed. "We just talk after school sometimes. About interpretation, feeling the music. It's not really teaching." "Sounds like teaching to me," Principal Wong said. "And sounds like you're good at it. We've had a budget request approved for an assistant music teacher, someone to help Ms. Rivera with individual students. 10 hours a week to start, with the possibility of expanding if there's enough interest." David stared at him, sure he'd misunderstood. "You want me to teach music? Here at the school?" "That's what I'm proposing, yes. You'd keep your current position with a slightly reduced schedule, and add these teaching hours. The pay is better for teaching, so your overall income would increase even with fewer custodial hours." David's mind raced with questions. "But I don't have a teaching degree. Or any degree. Don't you need qualifications?" Principal Wong leaned forward, his expression serious. "Normally, yes. But the school board has approved a special arrangement in this case. Your obvious expertise and the unique circumstances have convinced them to make an exception. You would work under Ms. Rivera's supervision, and we would encourage you to pursue education coursework at the community college. The district might even help with tuition reimbursement." It was too much to take in. David had come to Principal Wong's office expecting a reprimand for something. Maybe for the time he'd been spending with Thomas instead of cleaning the gym, or for the increased attention his story had brought to the school. Instead, he was being offered a chance to teach, to share his love of music with students who wanted to learn. "Can I think about it?" he asked. Principal Wong nodded. "Of course. But don't think too long. We'd like to get this started before the end of the semester." That night, David sat at his piano for hours, playing everything from Chopin to Billy Joel, letting his fingers find the rhythms of his thoughts. Teaching. At his age, with his lack of credentials, he was being offered the chance to teach music, to be more than the man who cleaned up after everyone else. Could he do it? Did he have anything worth sharing? The image of Thomas came to his mind, the boy's eager face as David explained how to bring emotion into a technical passage, how to make the notes sing instead of just sounding correct. The way Thomas had nodded, understanding immediately what David meant, then demonstrating it with his own playing. Maybe he did have something to offer after all. The next morning, David arrived at school earlier than usual. He found Principal Wong in the parking lot getting out of his car with a travel mug of coffee in hand. "I'll do it," David said without preamble. "The teaching position." "I want to try." Principal Wong's face broke into a wide smile. "Excellent. Come by my office during your lunch break, and we'll sort out the details." The next few months were the busiest of David's life. His new schedule had him cleaning the school in the mornings, teaching individual piano students in the afternoons, and taking an introduction to music education course at the community college 2 evenings a week. On top of that, he was practicing for his first formal performance at the Arts Center's summer concert series, working with the community theater as their rehearsal pianist, and giving private lessons on weekends to a growing list of students who had heard about the piano janitor and wanted to learn from him. It was exhausting, exhilarating. For the first time in decades, David felt fully alive, fully engaged with the world around him. There were challenges, of course. Some parents questioned his qualifications to teach their children. A few of his fellow custodians seemed resentful of his rising status within the school. And David himself still battled waves of self-doubt, moments when he was sure he was a fraud who would soon be exposed. But for every setback, there were moments of pure joy that made it all worthwhile. The look on a student's face when they finally mastered a difficult passage, the warmth of applause after a performance at the community center, the growing confidence he felt each time he sat down at a piano, no longer afraid to let others hear what he could do. The day of his debut at the Arts Center arrived in early June, just as the school year was ending. David had chosen a program of Chopin, Debussy, and a few modern pieces he loved, not too ambitious, but challenging enough to showcase his abilities. As he waited backstage, adjusting the sleeves of his new suit, a gift from the school staff, presented at a small party Ms. Rivera had organized on his last day of the semester, David thought about how much his life had changed in just a few months. His bank account had a cushion for the first time in years. He'd put a deposit down on a better apartment, one with thick walls where he could practice without disturbing the neighbors. He'd even started looking into programs to finish his long-abandoned college degree, encouraged by both Ms. Rivera and his professors at the community college. But more important than these external changes was the shift within himself. The weight of resignation that had pressed on him for so long, the quiet acceptance that his life would never be more than it was, had lifted. In its place was a tentative hope, a willingness to imagine futures he'd long since stopped believing were possible. A stagehand appeared at his elbow, breaking into his thoughts. "5 minutes, Mr. Chen," she said. David nodded, taking a deep breath to calm his nerves. He still got nervous before performances, but it was a different kind of nervousness now, not the paralyzing fear of failure that had gripped him at the talent show, but a more manageable anxiety, almost a form of energy he could channel into his playing. As he walked onto the stage a few minutes later, the lights momentarily blinded him, but as his eyes adjusted, he could make out faces in the audience. Ms. Rivera and Thomas in the front row, Principal Wong a few seats over, several of his students and their families scattered throughout the auditorium. There were strangers too, people who had read about him in the newspaper or seen his video online and come to hear him play in person. David sat at the grand piano, adjusting the bench to the right height. He placed his hands on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath his fingertips. For